What up? Grab a chair. Let's see. Pen have to be there?
So you can flip it over.
Like down here.
Flip it over.
Sorry about all that. Trying to use things device here. Okay. What's up? Looks like we've got a handful of people here, and hopefully you have at least a few questions. Ask some follow up from the video workshop, and hopefully you all found that useful. So I'm ready to get going whenever you are. Um, I'm assuming you can hear me. Where do you put? Let's see.
Chat should just pop up.
Let's see.
It's going to say something.
Chat, live chat. All messages are visible.
There you go.
Here we go. There we go. All right. Hello, people. We got. Looks like there's. Hey, what up? Good morning. We got any questions here at all? This is what we're here for. Good morning. Good morning. I wish I had some coffee. Tight.
I can run.
If you feel like it. There's you want to go hit heart?
Sure. Where's that?
Heart's over on Burnside. Yeah, just regular coffee's fine. Is this recording or no? Okay. Back tension. Oh yeah. All right, there we go. So to take some tension off the back spring, there's a few ways to do it. We can let me grab a machine and get a look at that real quick. Let's see. See if I have any shaders around here. I probably do. Hang on a second. Hold up. Uh-oh. BRB. I want to be doing this with a shader, but give me a second. I found a liner I can do it with, but I want to try to find something that's a better example. Oh, here we go. All right, so we're looking at how to take tension off of the rear spring, and this is a pretty good, pretty good example to use because there's quite a bit of tension on the back spring of this, and you can see there's there's a lot of tension by, like, if I just pull on that armature bar a little bit and that front spring is not moving off of the contact right away, like it's still staying attached to that as I pull on this a little bit, and it takes a little bit of pressure to pull that. You can see that there's kind of a little bit of excess spring tension. So I'm going to plug this guy in and see what sort of a difference we can make with a few adjustments by messing with that spring tension. Let's see if this thing even runs. Oh, here we go. Hang on. Bear with me here. Oh, that's the wrong clip cord. That's my fault. Okay. All right. So this guy's running on about 7.5 volts, and I know right, but there is a bit of excess spring tension on this, and on 7.5 volts, it's it's given up pretty easily, and it's not really wanting to do a whole lot. I can going up. I'm even on 8.5 volts there. It's still not that effective. So let's and this is feeler gauge stock. It's 18 thousandths, and this is it's been on this machine for 20 years, and it has not had any adjustment ever. I've never fooled with this. So I'm gonna drop it down to 7.5. It's still pretty soft there, and a lot of times the easiest way to do this for me is to just take and strike that right on top of that screw on the armature bar, just to relieve a little bit of tension from that. So, and I'll use something that's a little heavy, like this sort of a punch, or some people like to use a screwdriver, and that's already taken some tension out, and it's already it probably sounds like hell on that end, but here it actually runs pretty well, and it's already relieved that spring tension a little bit. Another way to do that without whacking it, if you don't want to strike the spring, and you might not feel comfortable. You might not feel comfortable doing that. The way to do it is just try to take some of the bend out of it. Let's see. So I'm going to just take and kind of pull this over to the side a little bit, and just tug on that just a little bit. No, it doesn't. If you do just a little bit at a time, it's not going to weaken the back spring. So we just pull a little bit on that and swing it back over and see. And you can see right away that that's taken quite a bit of tension off of it. Just that little bit. And that runs better already. And we can even drop it. So I was able to drop a full volt just by taking some of that spring tension off. And this thing runs really, really well. All right, so let's see if I have, what else we have here? Chat. Let's see. Give me a second. I'm gonna scroll through these. The spring tension. What cause and effect do capacitors have on the machine, and how thin would the 22 back spring compared to the? A thin with 22. All right, give me a second. I'm gonna try to break this down a little bit, one at a time. So Stephen's question is. What cause and effect capacitors have on the machine? The cause is the reason they're there is to kind of, oh crap, hang on, there's a noise. Hold up a second. All right, I'm back. I was trying to see what that vacuum situation was. The capacitor, there's the vacuum thing's gonna be making me crazy. Let me see if I can go get rid of that. Hang on. Sorry, guys. Hello. Sorry about that. All right, capacitors. So the capacitor kind of it stores a little charge, so that way when the circuit's open, it turns back on like right away as soon as it closes. So it's kind of an on and off sort of deal, and it can regulate help regulate the speed of the machine. So if you're trying to set up a liner and you've gone through everything you possibly can to speed it up, and it's not fast as you want, you can change your capacitor out and go with a lower UF, which will speed the machine up. And if you're trying to slow it down, go with something with a higher UF. So if you have let me show you a couple different examples. So, for example, on my liner coils, I pretty much default to a 22 UF, which is these little guys, and on my shaders, I default to a 47, like a 35 volt 47 UF, or sometimes I'll even use a 55 if I really want to make it slow. It sort of becomes part of the combination of things that you use. Just it's sort of another variable that you can use to affect the speed, if that makes sense. Let me pull up this chat again so I can see the, let's see. Give me a second here. And I'm trying to figure out what the second part of your question is, Stephen, where you say, how would a thin with 22 backspring be compared to wide 18 gauge speed-wise? Well, I don't ever use 22. I mean, you could, I guess you'd have to go pretty thin in order to make it be comparable to a wide 18. It's sort of, you can experiment with that, but what I can show you is I've got some 20 here that I just got that's 3/8, and I can compare that to, this is some 18 thousandths that's half-inch wide, and this is 20 thousandths that's 3/8 inch wide. And what I'm hoping for is being able to use this 20 thousandths on machines with a short spring gap and be able to slow it down a little bit since it's kind of narrow. So the thicker the spring is, the more narrow you're going to want it to slow a machine down, if that makes sense. Let's see, I'm trying to get this chat to stay up. Hold on a second. All right, so the next thing, and if you take the bend down from the back spring, does it not weaken the back spring? No, it's a spring. It's not, if you do it correctly, it shouldn't weaken the spring. You're not really, you're not trying to crease it. You're just trying to, set it where you want it. It's the idea of it is that it's going to remain a spring. Effective preload on the front spring, is there a time and place for it? Yes, it's a matter of how you want the machine to run. If when you have more preload on that spring, it's going to make the machine run a little bit slower. It's going to time it differently, and when you want there to be, you can put preload on the spring to get a little bit longer of a stroke, and to slow the machine down. It changes the way the machine cycles. Let's see. Do you know where the bend? Okay. How do you know where is the bend? If you move the spring to the side, is it not more secure to take off the coils? I wouldn't take off the. I mean, you can take off the coils if you want, but just when you're tweaking it off to the side like that, just be careful to pay attention to it, and just try to watch where you're bending it, and just be careful with it. Do you recommend bench running machine? You get them new. I'm very unlucky, but my last two machines broke on the first tattoo I did. I don't think that bench running them is gonna prevent springs from breaking. I've had the springs break in the middle of bench running. Like, I'll just hang them on a, I'll take them and hang them from my clip cord, like right here from my workbench, and later or the next day, and the springs are broken. It's really a matter of making sure all the parts fit together properly, and that the springs are you're not asking too much of them. Where do you get your feeler gauge stock? I use a company called MSC Direct. Let's see if I can, just to make it clear, it's MSC Direct. If you just look them up, they have all sorts of really cool feeler gauge stock. Let's see. All right. how critical is for the A-bar to hit flat, perfectly flush? Coils, tricks refining them perfectly flush hit. Jesse, I think that it's pretty critical. I mean, eventually it will seat in if your armature bar is soft enough and it's not super hard steel, it will seat flat with your coils, over some time. But I try to make them hit flat before they leave here. And some of the tricks to do that I went over in the video workshop. The the quickest, the fastest way to do it, when you pick the machine up and look at it and see if there's any light passing through. This one hits perfectly flat, so I kind of don't want to mess with it, but let me see if I've got one that doesn't. That one hits flat. I'm trying to find something that doesn't hit flat so I don't have to fuck with something that does. That one hits flat. Sorry, hang on. Okay, this one doesn't. Okay, hang on a second. I'm not able to look at all the questions while I'm doing this. So just a real quick trick to make this hit flat. So I'll loosen up. First I'll look at it and see what side of the coil, whether it's the front or the back or the side isn't hitting flat. I'll loosen the coil up, and then I'll just take a little piece of dollar bill. I have a million of them just sitting around here, just little scraps, and set it under the side that seems to be low, and get another look at it. And that's a really quick and easy way to do it. Another way to do it is to make sure, well, you want to make sure that your spring shelf is straight. Sometimes with brass machines, sometimes you'll look at the back of it and see that it's kind of sitting a little bit like a wonky angle. And brass machines, you can tweak them a little bit. You can actually bend the frame a touch to make sure that it's right, sit in perfectly square. It's not something I'd recommend doing unless you're really, really comfortable with that sort of a thing. Once I've got it shimmed in the right direction, I'll take a little bit of emery cloth or sandpaper. What's up? And then I'll just pull the A-bar down and kind of seat that a little bit. Let's see. I want the chat to stay up. Hang on a second. Let's see. Okay, that one's the angle of the front spring expected its performance. Would more angle equal slower running machine? Not necessarily. It's not about the angle of the spring. What's that? Cream? I don't fucking use that shit. Black coffee, dog.
That's what I thought.
The angle of the front spring, it's really for me, I kind of try to keep stuff pretty, like, you can get an idea by looking at some of the machines I've got sitting here. Just the way that I like my machines to run are all pretty similar. Like, that angle of all these machines is like almost identical, right? I like to keep a pretty low angle. What are you doing?
Good story, man.
So it's making the angle greater isn't going to slow the machine down. What's going to slow the machine down or speed it up is the width and length of the spring. The angle sort of just gets the tip of the spring where you need it to meet the contact. So if your contact is kicked way out just because your machine upright happens to be too far back, or maybe it's too far forward, the angle is just to sort of accommodate where that contact lands. Hope that makes sense. Let's see. I wish the chat would just stay up.
Does it?
It's like it won't all the chat visible, but it keeps leaving. Let's see. All right, hang on a second. Angle, not Thomas, probably have it as well. Thank you. How do you feel about the use of grommets? No, do not use them for setting up. Excuse me. Answers. Grommets on needle bars. I don't typically use them. Some people swear by them because I guess they find them to be really consistent. But I like to use paper towel, and the way that I use paper towel has pretty much always been the same. I can show you sort of how I set up. Grab a needle and a tube. just do this real quick. The paper towel, the way I do it. I'll take paper towel, fold it once, fold it once, fold. Oh, sorry. I'll fold it once, fold it one more time, and then one more time, and I'll make a little square like that. I try to not compress it too much because I like to retain some of that softness, that springiness, and then pull the needle up over it, press it on there one time. And once it's on there and it's good and snug, I don't mess with it. I set the rubber band. At that point, I don't use rubber grommets. The paper towel for me is just what's always worked perfectly, and so that's how I've, you know, usually if people say their machines are spitting, I'll assume that they're using grommets. Let's see. Let's go back. Let's see. Grommets. Let's see. Getting a shader, setting a shader, arrived at a point where I had CPS 100 to 105, but the duty was low, around 35. How do I get the duty around 50? And also low duty. I don't mess with duty at all. Like I don't really, that's a number that doesn't factor into the way I tune machines. If the machine runs right, if the machine is good, it works, then duty is a non-issue. I don't pay any attention to it. I feel like it's something that's it doesn't factor into the way I tune stuff. Frame geometry. Where can I find correct frame geometries for different frame styles? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Nate. What do you mean? Where can you find correct frame geometries? You know, the whole point of this is to illustrate that there kind of isn't really correct or incorrect. I mean, there's favorable geometry, and there's geometry that's easy to work with, but that it doesn't. You know, one is not correct or incorrect. It's just, you know, if you have a machine that's really long and you want to make it into a liner, how do we compensate for that and make it work what you want? You know what I mean? It's not about like this is the right geometry and that's the wrong one. If it's a short geometry and you need to make a shader out of it, the whole point of this workshop is to figure out how you do that. How do you define it's good or bad? Is there any bad? Yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes I try to tune machines and you know, somebody will send me something that somebody else made or whatever, and I'll question the geometry of the frame, like why why they would have made it that way, because you know, like for example, I came across this English machine the other day, and it had a really short armature bar, and it was supposed to be a shader, and everything was like stuffed into a tiny space, and the springs were really wide, and like every bit of it just like kind of flew in the face of logic. Didn't make any sense as far as like why they would even try to make a shader on that frame. So yeah, there's good and there's bad, and I guess it kind of comes down to like, is it easy to work with or favorable to work with? What is the air gap you recommend for the front spring to the front coil? Luis, I don't have a specific set measurement. What I recommend. This is all about figuring out what you like and what works for you, and it's more about how to get to the point where you know what you're looking for. You know, if you feel the machine and it runs right, and it does exactly what you want it to do, then that's what the air gap should be. If it's not working right, measuring that air gap and changing the air gap isn't going to be what makes the machine run right for you. Gary, the USA made hole punch. To be honest with you, the best punch is made in Germany by a company called Worth. And at this time, the only reputable supplier that I know that has them right now is Lucky Supply, and I think they're about $85. What are the reasons machines get hot? Machines get hot for a number of reasons. It could be the coils could be wound in opposite directions. Like when somebody spins a coil, they might not pay attention and run the machine backwards for one of them. An odd reaction and make a lot of heat and resistance. Capacitor can be bad. Your springs can be too wide. Your springs can be too thick. Your armature bar could be too light. There's a lot of reasons. It's really about what you're asking the machine to do, where it's why it's pulling excessive amperage. And when you see that amperage kind of come up over 0.75, zero 0.8 and above, that's when you're going to start seeing heat. Shaders lost top and increasing voltage past certain to do nothing, increase speed power. You start with new springs, adding more spring tension. Or Chris, seems to do nothing, increase the speed. Would you start with new springs? Might probably not. Probably doesn't need new springs. You probably just need to add a little bit of tension. I would imagine that it's lost some tension over the course of its life. I mean, I don't know how long you've had it, but without seeing it, I would assume that would be the first thing I would look at. The easiest thing would be to just put a little bit of tension on the back spring and start there. So the shader video, you shoot 15 in front and 20 in back. If you only had to put 5 on, what would it be similar? Yeah, like if you ended up only putting 5 on the front, then you might not have to put anything on the back. Again, like that, that 15 on one and 10 on the other, that was just for that one specific frame. That frame in particular, that's what it needed in order for it to be parallel. So, I will say that when I set up a shader, I do like to have a little bit larger of a gap above the rear coil, armature bar. I like to have a little bit more of a gap on a shader than a liner. The shader armature bar travels a bit more and it has more potential to slap against the top of that rear coil. So I like to leave a little bit more of a space. It's just the liner. When you pull a liner down, it doesn't quite travel as much, so you can get away with a tighter space. O-rings, what is the point? It's to stiffen up the front spring, so it can make the machine run softer, or it's to quiet a machine down. If somebody has set it up and they can't really get rid of a chatter, and they can't kind of track down where that chatter is coming from, they can put an O-ring on it, and it makes it sound better to them. It can make it sound quieter and smoother. How do you decide to feel what voltage is the ideal or machine at its best? Conkus, the way I figure out what voltage runs best is how well it tattoos and if the machine is running efficiently. If it's not getting hot and it's not breaking springs and it's putting tattoos in, then that's the best. Even if it's 13 volts or if it's 2 volts, it doesn't matter. Those meters, I wish that people wouldn't depend on the meter so much, because they, for years before we ever had them, we were tuning machines just fine with our ears and our thumbs, and with your client's skin. It's a shame that they've become sort of the go-to when we can just listen to the machines and feel them and say, this machine works well, and that's why I know it's right. Sanitizing your machines. What do you charge your machines for longevity, reduce spring rusting? Lauren, I recommend not touching them with bloody gloves while you're working. And if you do need to wipe them down with a Maticide or a Cavicide or some sort of antibacterial, after you do that, then I would try to hit them with a little bit of light oil at least once a week. Tweaks on springs. Giving the tip of the front spring a little bend. Can you explain the difference in rolling the front spring and propping it up at the fulcrum point? Rolling the spring gives it kind of a greater distance on which to kind of rely on that bend. That springiness is spread out over a greater distance. So it's you can slow a machine down by rolling that front spring and kind of increasing the radius of that bend. And sometimes I'll give a tweak on the tip of the front spring to compensate for the geometry a little bit. I'll kick it back if I feel like the spring would be too long if I were to kick the contact out further. So I'll bring the tip of the front spring back to meet the contact where it is. What frame style, in your opinion, is the best or easiest to make a shader? For me, it's this frame style. It's really, it's kind of universal. I like the Walker style for everything. For making shaders, it's just super easy. Remember where you got your spring alignment jig? Yeah, my spring alignment jig I got from my machinist who's dead, but I do know that Workhorse sells a good one. The best way to use your mouth is a pussy. Best place to get machine hardware. Workhorse has worth spring punches. I did not know that. I guess I should pay more attention. um, and best way to use mouth as a pussy, I would ask workhorse. They carry mouth pussy as well. Best place to get machine hardware. It depends on like how much of it you want. You know, if you're just getting stuff to work on your machines, I would contact Workhorse. I believe they have kind of some repair kits that are pretty inclusive. Or MSC carries screws in bulk if you really need it. Basically, what do you do for every basic day-to-day upkeep? Cleaning contacts, you know, all sorts of shit from sanding, use A&D to trap dirt. Don't use any A&D on your contacts. Don't put any grease on there at all. Sand it if you see there's some carbon buildup, but your any day-to-day upkeep there, you know, just pay attention to how it works. And if it feels like it's getting soft on you or chattery, just get a look at your springs and throw a little more tension on your rear spring. How can you adjust your rear binding post to get better connectivity with your clip cord? All right, this is going to take me a second for Ian. So here's an example of that. When I set machines up, I really try to look at the way the clip cord lines up and how comfortable that is for somebody to use. This machine in particular, I made the binding post specifically to line up with that hole there. So when you put this in, it's parallel, right? If it's off, like this guy here, and you know it's kind of sitting at a wonky angle. That's probably why I've never really used this machine. Somebody gave me years ago, is because it doesn't line up right and it's uncomfortable. So you've got like this much of a gap, right? So typically what I'll do is, you know, since I have the luxury of a workshop, is I'll raise a little piece of metal on the back here and move this binding post out, or I'll make a binding post that changes the location of that. And I think I might have something that can show you a good example of how that works. Let's see. My stash here. Give me a second. All right, so here's a good example. This guy here has a binding post that I brazed a little nut onto, and what I could do with that is put that on there and it moves it outward, right? Just changes the location of it so everything lines up parallel. Another way to do that is to make a little pigtail like this and put it where you want it. You know, I like to do that in a vise, and I use a torch and heat it up so I can bend it nicely without breaking the bar. You know, or drill a hole in the frame and move the thing, you know, drill another hole in the binding post. But for me, it's really important to try to get that lined up. Let's see. What else here? Mentioned spitting and possibly caused by grommets. I sometimes I feel like the grommets cause spitting because they're so stiff and they don't really give. I like to have a little bit of give, not a whole lot, but where that A-bar connect, or where your needle bar connects with the A-bar, I like to have a tiny bit of play. I don't like it to be super tight, and also the grommets can be loose and have too much play. When you grab the needle bar and pull up and down on it when it's against the A-bar and the grommets in there, you can feel a little bit of play. And you know, some people have said, you know, you just take a pair of pliers and tighten up the needle bar loop on the grommet itself while it's on the A-bar. But I just avoid that and just use paper towels. It's what I've always used. I don't think I've used a grommet. I mean, I might have maybe one or two here or there, but in the last 25 years, I can count on one hand the time I've used grommets. In fact, the core top of the coil is really thin, like here was so they were as close to the machine. What I found, they make the machines run really strong. When you have like this machine here is really close like that. The tops are really thin, and you're moving that wire closer to the armature bar, you're putting that magnetic field closer to the object of the magnet, right? And when you feel a hybrid machine or a DOS machines, those things hit hard as fuck. And I attribute that to the 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 tops of the coils being really short like that, and also the gauge of the wire. They're super hard hitters. Let's see, check. Bending needles. Yeah, I like to. Well, I always bend the needle bar a little bit. I like to put a little bit of an arc on, especially shaders. Trying to building up some of the classic machines frames. Where could I buy quality frames? Nate, you can get frames from Workhorse. They've got quite a few different frames available and some build-it-yourself kits. We've actually been talking about putting together some other kits recently, maybe with the classic juniors, the little Coleman style frames. And I know that they've got some of these guys and probably some other ones. Coil wraps change the bar track. Hang on, these things, the chats keep going away. You're very welcome, Lauren. Thanks for being here and participating. Does the coil wraps change the A-bar traction first too, then as well as the thickness? Coil wraps change the A-bar traction. So are you saying I'm not sure what your question is, Conkus. You lose connectivity to click cord at different angles. I've checked it is not the click cord is unique to that machine. Yeah, the reason that you would lose connectivity is because it's just not a good fit. If it's not lining up really well, like this one here doesn't, like it's okay. It's not great. If it's not, I'm trying to find a good example for you. All right, so on this machine that Soba made, he's got a binding post on here that's specifically made to line up with this hole right here, right? And if this wasn't there and I had to use this here, where it would naturally line up, you can see that when you rotate the machine, it just wants to pop out of there. So that's where you're losing connectivity, is when it's not a really clean connection and you change the angle that you're working, it literally pushes the clip cord out of the binding post and you lose contact. It makes the machine run like shit. Yeah, I mean, I do look at it, but for me, it's really like when I go to set up a liner or a shader and how I want it to run, I'll think like, what do I want this thing to do? Do I want it to be, for small groupings or large groupings? How quickly do I want to be able to move my hand, or how quickly does the person want to be able to move their hand? And I'll have a target in mind, and I'll start cutting springs and setting up an armature bar, and then put everything together, and then look at the meter to see if I'm on target. So if I'm thinking like I want something to run around 135, I'll do the work first, and then I'll look at the meter to check and see if that's where I go. I hope that makes sense. Cycles per second play a factor in tuning a machine. Yeah, I mean they really do. It's just one of your targets, and the tuning is what you use to get to that target. In order, depending on how the machine wraps the coils or have the thickness of the wire. I'm still not sure what you're trying to say. If they hit harder depending on machine wraps, on how the machine wraps the coils, or have the thickness of the wire. All right. Are you asking if the machine hits harder or softer depending on thickness of wire? If so, that can be the case. If you have a thicker gauge of wire, you're going to have a certain degree of lower resistance that will allow the machine to hit harder and often slower. If the wire's thinner, you'll have more resistance, and it will change the way it will make the machine run softer. What gauge do you use for coils? I use 24. What are some good pranks to pull on coworkers? Recently put a tape on Lauren. A little piece of super glue, a little drop of super glue is amazing. I went into invisible tattoo years ago, and grabbed a little vial of super glue and went into a guy's drawer and put a little bit of super glue on the contact, pulled the armature bar down and put super glue on the contact of every one of his machines, and left and like let them dry and then closed them. And then so when he came into work the next day, none of his machines worked, and he was freaking out. And he couldn't figure out why. It was fucking amazing. Could you please talk a bit about tension at the contact point and to fine tune that? Okay. Tension at the contact point. Well, that's where that's sort of your spring preload, and the more preload you have, the slower your machine is going to be, and I guess that's going to change what people call duty. And there's really like it's not about fine tuning that. It's like figuring out what works for you. If the machine is running too slow, take some of that preload out. If it's running too fast, put some more preload on and just bend it in whichever direction helps you get the result you want. Right? Can you explain briefly what the duty and follow through is, please? So let me plug a machine in here and get a look. So the duty on this says it's like 54, 55, and from what I understand, that's the amount of time that the circuit is open or closed. I don't remember which it is. It's either open or closed. And the follow through is that kind of that little bit of movement on the contact point there. That FT, that higher FT means it's sort of like a less. So on this meter, it's one of the critical. It's not labeled FT. It's able to STL, which is settle, which is that little bit of excess contact that it's making when it opens and closes. It's that like a little bit of extra almost like dwell. It's right there. I hope that makes sense. Use the same height coil cores for most builds. Mostly I use 1 1/4 and 1 inch. I don't really use anything. Once in a while I use 1 1/8, but for the most part it's pretty standard. Just the 1 1/4. If I'm building a shorty, or the wiener dogs and stuff like that, they use the short coils. Frame first or mechanics coils type of A-bar, etc. I start with a frame. When I build a machine from scratch, I just figure out what I want it to look like. These days, like this one in particular, it literally was, let's see. Hang on. So, these days now when I make a machine, I grab the material first and I go, what is this going to look like? And this is the sort of material I'm working with these days. So I think like, what kind of a frame can I make from this? I could make something that looks like this. I can make something that looks like this. I can, I don't know. There's only, it really depends on like what you're working with. If I've got like this, I can make pretty much anything. I'm not really working with any pre-made side plates anymore, and I'm really trying to avoid using like new materials. I'm just trying to use old stuff that I have or stuff that I find. So I have a bucket of this stuff that will probably last me forever, and that's how I figure out where I start. Let's see. Backspring gap distance, a byproduct of the armature bar length, is something you seek to control. Achieved by a long armature bar with slices taken out of it to lighten. William, I thought I answered this in the video workshop. That was sort of the whole point, and I know that in the liner segment we get into this a lot with the weight of the armature bar. It's spring gap distance a byproduct of the armature bar length? Um, I feel like the armature bar length is a byproduct of the frame length. I think that like you have your frame first, and then you make or buy your armature bar to suit it, and then make your springs to sort of accommodate both. You know, if you have a long spring gap and a short armature bar, then you're like, oh shit, I need to make wider springs. Or if you have, I hope that makes sense. And what differences would be achieved by a long armature bar with slices taken out? So a long A bar with slices taken out of it to lighten it would speed it up. Like, you know, this guy here, this is a shader that a friend made, and you can see that he's it's a little different than I would do it, but he's got a short spring gap and lightened A bar, and I think this was set up to do to run fast for a shader. I don't use it. Let's see. Is the backspring gap? Those are shorter than naturally lighter A bar, as opposed to you can sort of like that, like so. The slices taken out, it's going to lighten it up, but when you have a longer A bar and you tighten up that spring gap, it will speed the machine up. The shorter one, while speeding it up, might not run as hard as you want it to, and that's why on my liners I'll typically use a longer A bar with a long nipple on it to fill in that gap so they hit as hard as I want them to. I hope that makes sense. If a machine is running erratic, troubleshoot causes. I'm not sure what you're asking, Stephen. What is material used for frames? Do you make A bars or buy them pre-made? So not dead yet. I just use mild steel. You know, I mean, sometimes I use brass or iron. I just pretty much use whatever I've got, as long as I can use a torch to put it together most of the time. What was the other part of the question? I'm trying to pull the chat up. Use of frames, and do you make A bars or buy them? A little bit of both. I get some A bars from Workhorse, and I make some A bars. I really like making them, but you know, it can be tedious, and it's not always the most efficient. But I do enjoy it. I enjoy making them, and I like the way the machines run when I make them one at a time. And plans on a Cholomatic variants. Yes, I'll be working with Workhorse to make a handful of new things soon, and we do like that Cholomatic frame is it's a really good base, and we have some good ideas for some new stuff with it. Let's see, in your opinion, black and gray coil shader be as good as one of those new rotaries in terms of softness and blending? Conkus, I've never used rotaries really. I've tried it a couple of times, but never for black and gray. I've just, you know, I've done a couple of simple tattoos, some traditional stuff with a rotary just to try it out and see how I liked it. But I mean, you know, you want to ask somebody who uses both extensively. I know that I still make black and gray machines for people, and they you know, they love coils, and there are other people who just, you know, say that the rotaries are just much easier to use. So I think it's just a matter of personal preference. I don't know that like one's better than the other, or as good, or not as good. I wouldn't be the person to say. I just like, you know, just set them up the way I do, and if people like them, then that's great, and if they don't, then they use something else. I don't wish I had a better answer for that. Let's see. What else? Let's see if I missed anything. Nate has been wondering why the Workhorse machines come with blue-tempered spring steel. After watching a video, it makes me wonder what parts of Workhorse machines are top quality. Workhorse stuff. What I like about Workhorse stuff is it's 99% made in house, and you know, the deal with the springs is like, you know, for a long time we were able to get really good spring stock, and that's why, you know, when you know, we've we had them made years ago, we were able to get really good stuff. Over the last several months, we found that um, the materials are like not as good as they used to be. So Workhorse has actually been. It's funny you bring that up. They sent me some samples of some new springs that are supposed to be unbreakable and pretty amazing stuff that's made specifically for tattoo machines. Um, I wouldn't second guess their motives on quality. I think it's a matter of finding the right stuff that works and being able to obtain it consistently. When we bought those springs years ago, we got a ton of them, and that was back when you were able to get good steel. And as it's become less and less available, we've been looking for better alternatives. It's normal for a machine to sound a bit rough when not loaded, but when yeah, Jesse, that's totally normal. I mean, to be honest, like if it tattoos well, like if it does what you want it to do, then it shouldn't matter what it sounds like. When you use it and it works and you get a good result and the tattoo heals right and it's not bleeding everywhere and you're getting the saturation you want and you're like getting the type of shading you want, then the sound doesn't matter, especially when it's not loaded. Like, I mean, like it doesn't like does it matter what a car runs right if a car is running right if you're not driving it? Like it's what matters is how well it works. Seems popular for every now and then. So many guys making machines for that style, and a lot of dudes who you do it these roadies. What build would you use? Well, for me, and this is just me personally, for like really small stuff, single wheel stuff, I like a fast running liner. And the reason I like a fast running liner is because I feel like there's sort of less opportunity for, hold on a second, I'll try to answer that. Less opportunity for error. Like if the machine's running faster and you can move your hand faster, there's literally like less wiggle room. If the machine's running slower and you have to move your hand slower, then you have kind of more opportunity for wiggling, for things to move around. If you ever watch Philip Liu line stuff with a single, he's like super fast, really, really fast. You really couldn't do that with a slow running machine. You just get a whole bunch of dots. With a fast running machine, you're able to make a line very, very deliberately and very consistently, and move your hand as fast as you can. And as far as shading goes, for black and gray, I like to use, I will typically set up a cutback liner and run it really soft, so it's fast and soft. So it's not really getting a whole lot of, you're not really seeing a whole lot of the dotting that you would with like typical traditional tattooing. You're not really saturating as much. You're working off the tips of the needles, and you're working really fast, and you're working really shallow to try to like build up your layers. You know what I mean? Let's see. You didn't have a piece of spring to roll your springs. What else works? Are your thoughts on those tools that help you roll springs? Using like a knife, like if you have a Leatherman tool, something like that. Like somebody in the shop has a knife. A blade of some sort, just anything that you can stick under their line. You make a good black gray shader apart from making it faster. I'm actually going to be making a video as a free supplement for this workshop that just focuses on black and gray. It's going to be like an additional thing that you guys can watch for free. That it'll probably be about 15 minutes. And it'll just kind of give you a basic rundown of how to make a good black and gray machine from something that you already have, because I realized that I left that out of the shader video. So I will address that just to, let me see if I can answer it quickly, but I will be making a supplement video for free. Make a good black and gray shader apart from making it faster. How to make it hit soft. Conquest pretty much just by doing all the stuff that we went over. If you wanted to hit softer and faster, use a wider rear spring. Use a lighter armature bar. Use a smaller capacitor. There's so many little tricks. Even like on the Cholomatics, I'll use an O-ring to make them hit softer, so that way like they have a lot of give. Same story for color versus gray wash shader. No, Steven, I use a shorter for gray wash. A lot of times I'll set up for me, if I'm doing gray wash, I'll use a cutback liner. And the first time I ever saw anyone do that was I saw Paul Booth shading with a Mickey Sharp's micro dial like 20 years ago, and he was just working off the tips. And I was just like, man, he's shading with a liner. It was so smooth, and like he just his result was just like, you know, undisputable. Like it worked really well. So from that point, I started setting up my for me when I worked through black gray, I started just setting up a cutback liner to do it. It'll be available on the site to replay anytime. Yes, not dead yet. It will be. It's up for the life of this program, and it'll be online for as long as you want it. In addition to any other live Q&As that we do. So for the next enrollment period, when we do this workshop again, those who have already done it will have access to the next live Q&As, and any additional questions and answers that come up, you guys will have access to it for the life of this program. And that's why I feel like it builds value as it goes on, and as we have more and more people involved, it becomes kind of more of a community, sort of like we had with the forum back in the day, where people are like, you know, putting ideas out there and exchanging ideas and commentary and information, and it sort of becomes archived and accessed by anyone who's part of this thing, which I think continues to add value to it, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so we're about at an hour. Right about now, I can take a couple more questions if you guys want. Thanks, Lauren. If you guys have a couple more, let's do it. And it's been fun, and I'm happy to do this whenever we have the chance. So the next time will be 2 weeks from now, on that Monday, the Monday following the liner workshop. Let's see, Conkus in the video. Mr. Chant, can you say where you get American-made spring stock? I've had very little luck finding American-made spring stock, but I have been able to get feeler gauge stock that's American-made, and you can get it from Starrett or from MSC Direct. Let's see, MSC Direct. And Robert, doing this. Angle contact screw has in relation to the front spring. No, there's not a specific angle or specific inclination. It's really about where you want it to be. You know, like, do you want it to be, like this machine is kind of straight up and down, right? If we were to move it out like this, okay, and let's back this up a little bit. Hold up. All right, so previously it was like this. It's kind of straight up and down, right? It's a pretty mild angle, but you have kind of a short spring on this. If you move this out like this, right? That's kind of just an exaggeration, but if we move it out like that, then that means we need to have a longer front spring to meet this contact here. And as your front spring gets longer, it gets more narrow, right? Like, so the longer it is and the more narrow it is, the more it's going to bend and the softer it's going to be. So if we were to move this out here, change the angle to here, make a longer spring, that spring should in theory get thinner and thinner, and it's going to slow the machine down and make it hit harder, right? So if you move this back here, even more perpendicular, like that, right? And you shorten that front spring, it's going to make that front spring stiffer. So that's where the angle of the contact comes into play with all this. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. Come on. Best place to get heat-treated coils. I think Workhorse has good coils. AMR has good coils. Lucky's has good coils. I'm pretty sure, so Jay Kelly took over Pulse Tattoo Supply, and I think he's going to be doing coils, and his stuff's really good. So venting spring on machine does it not create a crimp? Would it be better to slightly roll over and strings outside the machine to prevent a crimp? No, I mean, if you do, you're not really creating a crimp. You're being careful where to put that bend, so the spring assembly actuates where you want it to. You want to, like if your rear spring were rolled it wouldn't really have a specific point at which like your geometry starts to come into play. Like you want to use the geometry. You don't want it to be ambiguous. You want it to start at a definite point. So I typically don't roll them because I want it to have like a deliberate function. I hope that makes sense. Would you get frame CNC to prefer to cut and build from scratch? I prefer to cut. And for me personally, when I make custom machines, I prefer to make them from scratch. Thanks, Gina. I appreciate that a lot. Thanks, Nate. For smooth shading, best coil capacitor combo for these. I don't know. What do you mean by, Christy? Do you mean by black and gray smooth shading? Do you mean for like color? I mean, I think it's really, it comes down to your hand technique. Your like, let's see. You know, sometimes I'll, you know, for a black and gray machine, I'll use like 6-wrap coils and 22 capacitor. And for color, I'll go 8-wrap coils or 10-layer coils, and I'll use a 47 capacitor. It depends on what you're trying to do. You know, do you like, it's not going to be, one's not going to be smoother than the other, but if the machine runs a little bit, let's see, fish scale or grapher, does that mean, is it about cocaine? What does that mean? Fish scale. What that means. So Christy, if you're, you know, if what you mean by smoother is like less peppery, like you know, gaffer, fish scale or gaffer, that's personal preference, man. It depends on what you're doing with it. So you know, if you want the machine to run slower and hit harder, you know, use a larger coil, use larger wraps, or in more wraps and a larger capacitor. And if you want the machine to run faster and softer, or not necessarily softer, but faster, use a smaller capacitor and smaller coils, and there will be less time between strikes. So you're in essence kind of creating less of a dotted, stipply kind of pattern. You know, like the slower the machine, the more you're going to see the dots on the skin. I hope that makes sense. Okay. All right. We're done here. It's been a little over an hour. I'm going to wrap up. I appreciate all the questions. Keep in mind that you're able to get back in on the live Q&As as we do more, which we will be doing. And we have another live Q&A in 2 weeks. So I look forward to hearing additional questions and some feedback. Hopefully everybody is getting out of this workshop what the intent is to, you know, just be more comfortable with your stuff. And this isn't going to be an overnight process. This is going to maybe take a month for you to figure this out. And that's why I'm here to do this with you, right? So hopefully, let's see. Thank you guys all so much, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Let's see, how do we end this?